Hey, I came across this argument by Skeptic that I wanted to share a few thoughts with. I thought it was pretty interesting. I like a lot of his work because it makes you think about things, even if you disagree with him, it makes you think about some good things. Um, he's got this video called something about could God be evil, basically, a maximally evil God, and how it's very similar to the argument that a theist would say that there's a maximally good God. And I think his point is not to show that one is true or one is false or anything, but it's to show that a maximally evil God being dismissed just because you say there's good in the world is just as silly as a theist dismissing a maximally good God not existing because there's evil in the world. And I think in that he made a really good point, but it's kind of like the whole argument to me just seems a little ill-founded. Not necessarily on his fault, but I think a lot to do with like theists' response to this basic question, this question of the problem of evil, which is why it's such an enticing topic to think about. So he sort of opens the discussion with this quote by J.L. Mackie. It says, "If a good God existed, he would want to remove all evil and would have the power to do so. The existence of evil in the world foreshadows that a good God doesn't exist." And this seems pretty compelling, and it also appeals to our idea that, we fixate on suffering and the problem of suffering. It's a huge deal to most of us. It's a very emotional issue. And this seems like a very good argument on the surface, but if you look at it at a philosophical level, a level of logic, reason, rationality, it's got a lot of assumptions in its premises. There's a lot of premises in this. First of all, there's the premise that a God exists, and that's foundational to the argument, and that a good God exists. So those are not like ones that you can question, because the whole point is if a good God existed. The next one is he would want to remove all evil. He would have the power to do so. That's omnipotence. The existence of evil in the world foreshows that a good God does not exist. I think the first assumption here is that we all have the same page of what good and evil are, which I know we don't. And I think a lot of theists defend this by saying this is the best world, or the maximally good world that is possible because of human freedom. And they say human freedom is even greater than the suffering it takes to have human freedom. But from a foundational point of view, it seems like they've skipped a step, because from a secular, atheistic, or agnostic perspective, we would say that good and evil are pleasure and suffering. I think Cosmic Skeptic, he uses this sort of model when he talks about good and evil. Sam Harris and Rationality Rules and a couple other people, they like to say well-being, but essentially Alex means the same thing, because he says you wouldn't have the most well-being if you had a little bit of pleasure now and suffered greatly thereafter for it. So essentially they mean the greatest common good for the most people at the most time. That's what they all mean by that. And this is certainly not the theistic view if you have an understanding of theology or religious literature at all. Maybe the modern theologians don't read the past things. I don't know, because they seem to say, oh, well, this is the greatest, the least amount of suffering possible. And it's like, in all the literature of religions, God never means suffering is evil or that goodness is pleasure. It's never been defined that way from a religious landscape. From a religious landscape, most gods of different religions partake in suffering. In fact, the Christian God embodied suffering and suffered in the most emotional, spiritual, and physical torment that could have been imagined at the time that the New Testament was written, the Roman crucifixion. So to say that God is good does not mean that God does not suffer. Otherwise, the Christian God could not have suffered or would not have suffered. And I know in essence they would say that the essence of divinity does not suffer. But still, to say a maximally good God is to say that God does not partake in suffering is not the case. So you have two people kind of arguing past each other. One says, an all good God wouldn't allow suffering because goodness is not suffering, and the other says, skips right past it, even though in their view, virtue is goodness, and vice and sin would be evil, which are completely different things. So a maximally good God would not necessarily have the most limited suffering, but would have the most virtue. A second point in this is the fact that the universe or creation or whatever in the theist's view would be what God made, what is not God himself, doesn't have to have the attributes of God himself. So if God is maximally good, it doesn't follow to reason that what is not God is also must necessarily be maximally good. And we kind of think on intuition, how can that be? How can, if God is the source of everything, then everything else has to have his attributes too, and I think that's kind of the point of the free will discussion. The point of the free will discussion is that God has sort of made the unliftable rock. Everyone says the omnipotent sort of argument that can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Well, he kind of already did if God did exist and God did make human freedom. In the theist perspective, God made a person, or lots of people, who have a free will that he cannot change. He made something that in essence is not what his essence is, and therefore doesn't have to share in his attributes and doesn't have to have the same qualities as him. Obviously, we don't think that his creation is omnipotent, so why do we think it has to be all good? It's kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind about, but it isn't logically consistent to apply the same sort of necessities on God than we would on creation. So my final point, and I'm trying to make this video short, my final point is just about the whole sort of pushback by a lot of Christian or religious people I've seen on this topic that like to say this possibly could be the best possible created world. And I don't know why they would say that, because I don't think that really follows in their religious theology either. Because the whole point of freedom is that it could have been worse and it could have been better. Because if the whole free will thing is consistent, if that is real, then the creation should have to have necessarily been better, unless it freely chose to be the best possible, or it could have had to been worse unless it chose to be the worst possible. And I don't think we see that either of those in our world today. So I don't know why this is defended so hard against that, with freedom this is the best possible world that could have existed. In conclusion, God being evil or good isn't talking about suffering. Number two, creation or whatever is other than God in the universe doesn't have to have the same attributes as we attribute to God. And finally, if there is free will, suffering, evil, goodness, whatever is in the universe and in creation says more about us than it does about God, given that we would have a free will from God and we could actually be responsible for the way we have turned out in that scenario. So these are just some of my thoughts I wanted to get down and share with some people, and I hope some people find this interesting. Thank you.